everyone. I'm Robert Cohen, and I'm the MC for a few minutes tonight. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Bob Jacobs. And his topic at this moment, whether this is being seen now at 6 p.m. West Coast time, or whether it's being seen a year from now at a different time zone, is a most important topic for mediators and mediation advocates. Welcome to mediation, why the other side won't settle, and what you can do about it. Now, I've had the pleasure of talking with Bob for about the last 15 minutes, and he is a lawyer's lawyer. He had decades of experience as a litigator, a trial lawyer, worked the defense, worked plaintiff's cases, did trials, I'm sure many, many arbitrations and many, many mediations. And he's a very thoughtful, nuanced person, and he's brought that to his mediation practice. He started off on his own, and then ultimately he, after coming back from Africa, and there's a bunch of interesting stories which we won't get into, I'm sure, about him, he went full-time with Judicate West. And I think that you and I will have a lot to learn today, and I would like to throw the microphone over to Bob now and ask him to start his program. And I thank you very much for your participation today, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Happy to be here. The nice thing about this program is that it has an opportunity, or people who attend will have an opportunity to ask questions of someone who spends their days dealing with very difficult situations and seeing things from both sides. The way this program is set up is to ask questions at the end, so please keep track of your questions. The program will go about an hour, and then we have time afterwards. I'm happy to stay late and answer as many questions as there are. And with that, we will get started. So here is the program. I need to share my screen, so I don't know who the person is that I talked to about this. That's where the program is. I don't see there's not an icon here for sharing a screen.
It should be the green button, share.
Got it right here, thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay, this program, why the other side won't settle and what you can do about it. And I'll take this to the next slide. This is an interactive program. So what you want to do is take your cell phone and scan this QR code. And then what happens is you can watch the program on your screen, on your computer screen, and then the phone gets turned into a polling device. It's interactive, and so the voting takes place on your phone. So you can, if you wanted to, you could watch the whole thing on your phone, but it's probably a little bit bigger and easier to watch on the computer screen. So if you don't get this scanned or you have any trouble with it, you can go to the URL that's on the left-hand side, www.menti.com, and enter this code that's down there, and that is on the top of every slide. So if you get disconnected, you can join by going to that URL and then entering the code at any time during the program. Today we're going to talk about 4 reasons why the other side won't settle at mediation and what you can do about it. So number 1, why won't the other side settle? Here is the first reason that we'll talk about: because they don't see the case like you do. So this is our first interactive part of this presentation. Your phone will give you an opportunity to tap in answers, a limited number of characters, but let's get some collective thoughts here about how do you best help the other side see liability and damages like you do. You can enter it into your phone and then hit submit, and we'll start seeing them show up on the screen here. How can you best help the other side see liability and damages like you do? Yes. explain using case law and facts evidence presented in case in an email. Absolutely. What else do we have? This is a comment from a mediator. Caucusing each party separately to find out what they need. Absolutely. We will talk about that during this program indirectly. Explain a point they haven't considered. Yes. Share brief. Share evidence. Double yes. Meet and confer. Don't hold anything back. Give all records, evidence, etc. Absolutely. Just a comment on this. I occasionally get mediations. I'm a little bit of an outlier. When I do my mediations, I ask for briefs 2 full weeks in advance. And that's so that I have plenty of time to digest them. And then I hold mediation conferences a week in advance. And then that gives us some runway in case there's things that needs to happen. So the other side has enough time to evaluate the case. I occasionally have situations where parties want to submit a brief to me and do not want to give it to the other side. This comment here about don't hold anything back. I mean, there may be reasons for not exchanging a brief, but the key thing is if you don't share your brief, then they're not going to include that in their case evaluation. So anything that the other side needs in order to evaluate the strength of your position absolutely has to be sent to the other side. Starts with developing rapport and cooperative and collaborative rapport. Yes. Needed to explain. Yes. Find the party to explain background. Thank you. All good comments. Every one of them. Here's some distillation or some crystallization. If you represent a plaintiff, make sure the other side has all the facts and all the law that establish liability. So what I say in my mediations is, please exchange briefs 14 days ahead and submit them to me. If you have something that is for my eyes only, send me a separate brief or a separate letter that explains that, but give the other side the background on your case so they can see the case the same way that you do. If you represent a defendant, make sure the other side has all the facts and the law that establish a defense. And then this is a big one. I have this again and again and again, as recently as last week. I get a case in, they come in for maybe it's pre-litigation mediation. I just had another one set for next week. So no complaint has even been filed yet. But all the defense has is a bare number and an allegation with no documents, no kind of documentary support as far as the quantification or the nature of the damages. And there may be a case somewhere in another universe where somebody just makes an allegation, and if the other side knows that there's something that maybe the plaintiff doesn't know and they're really anxious to settle, then they might settle on that basis. But barring a case like that, every defendant is going to want to see how your damages are calculated. It's essential, and it's a surprising occurrence how often it happens that that won't be worked out before the mediation. And so that's one of the reasons why I say let's have the pre-mediation conference a week ahead. And if we don't have that information, it's like making homework assignments. You know, are you willing to provide this or willing to provide this? Please get it to the other side as soon as possible. All of this may seem self-evident. I promise you it is not. So let's talk about this. Now, this gives you an opportunity on your phone to vote on this. And let's see what our collective thought is. Why don't counsel disclose key facts or law in mediation, especially when that kind of information, those facts or law, are essential for the other side to make a studied decision on the strength and the value of your case? How come that doesn't happen? So you can look at the options on your phone, choose one or two, and then submit. What we kind of generally have at this point, the runaway winner is they are concerned the other side may influence, taint, or modify the evidence. A valid consideration, especially if depositions have not been taken or there's information you think the other side doesn't know, or that they may come and try and change things. A valid concern. So that can be a legitimate and a real factor in why key facts or law are not disclosed at mediation. And there can be situations where it makes sense to do that. You may think the case is perhaps poised for settlement without some of your strongest points because they're not necessarily set in concrete and they might be able to be changed by the other side. If so, then it's a studied decision about whether or not you share that. My experience is, number two, they have not worked up their own case. So many times, I'm going to share with you, I'm sure we have a number of mediators who have joined us today. They'll understand perfectly what I'm talking about, but I'm going to share with you some of my own thought processes when these cases come in. When a case comes in, I get a case and I get a brief that has facts and law inside of plaintiffs or defense, and then I get the mirror image from the other side. And one of the great things about the case is I come to it fresh, like a judge would, and I'm not invested with the client. So my vision is just about as clear as it's going to get for anybody. It's a neutral third person. When I get the case in, I look at it through the eyes of how would I be working up this case? I absolutely do that. And what would I need and what would I want to see in order to evaluate this case? And if that's not present in the briefs, then I'm talking with counsel about it. I never move in front of them. You can't do that because that's going to kill your, if you move out ahead of counsel, it's going to kill your rapport and your trust, and that goes nowhere. So you can't move ahead of counsel. But I will absolutely be talking with counsel and saying, have you considered giving this to the other side? Or what about this? There's some holes here, either in liability or in law that don't add up on what you need in order to put together your prima facie case. What about this? Sometimes they need to go out and see if there's some additional background that they can put together. But if they don't have a case, it can be very, very tough to get the other side to see it like you see it. This number three, they plan to ambush the other side at trial. I promise you that when you're involved in those caucuses and the other side is refusing to budge and it feels like they're giving you a stonewall, sometimes it is, but a surprising number of times it is not. And the reason I know that is because I sit with the other side and I hear what they have to say. And I know I can be snowed. I know that, but I don't think that most of the time I can be snowed. And I hear what the other side says, both client and counsel. And many times counsel are willing to let their clients talk freely at these mediations. And that can absolutely work magic when that happens for a lot of reasons. It allows me to find out what the values of the client are. And once I understand the values, then I can try to work to see if we can achieve those. But as I hear what they're saying and I hear what's important, sometimes they can't come down to the range or come up to the range that the other side is talking about. And it feels like it's a complete stonewall, but it's not. It's just a different in need or a difference in perspective. So it feels like they're like they've come to mediation, not even planning to settle, like they're looking for a fishing expedition or a free discovery opportunity. There might be the occasional blue moon case like that, but I do not see them often at all. So they don't plan to settle mediation. I don't see that. They plan to ambush the other side at trial. I don't see that. Very infrequently. The other side just has legitimate needs or problems or issues that impede settlement, but it's not typically because of those two. If the key facts or the law are not provided to the other side, they will not include them in their case evaluation, which means they're not going to have them in their settlement negotiations. It's plain as day, simple math. So the first point is, why doesn't the other side see the case like you do? It may be because they don't see the same facts or the same law that you do. So the first thing you can do to help the other side see the case like you do is make sure they see all of the facts that you know that are favorable to your case and the law. That's the first point. Here's the second point. Why won't the other side settle? Sometimes, even if they have the facts and law, they don't value the case like you do. Genuine differences of opinion and likely trial outcome account for many differences in case valuation. And of course, the trial outcomes, the difference of opinion literally comes down to what's a judge going to do, what's a jury going to do. And there is no exact science on that. So that accounts for many times the difference in case valuation. Money is always important, but it isn't always the only answer. Settlements are driven by decisions, and decisions are based on values. The huge majority of times, the decisions, settlement decisions, are based on values. So that's why, as a mediator, it is essential to the extent that I can that I find out what the values of counsel are, which many times are what you'd expect them to be, and especially the clients. Some non-monetary considerations can significantly affect negotiations and settlements. The other side won't always tell you when their non-monetary values are driving their negotiations, but it doesn't mean that they aren't. And I see this again and again and again. Money is always important, but sometimes there are other things truly that drive the settlement decisions that are not just money. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. So what kind of non-monetary considerations are we talking about? It's the principle of the thing. Sometimes it's death to a case. When a client walks in, especially an unsophisticated client, says it's the principle of the thing, and you're going, well, principle has value, but I saw a great cartoon years ago from the New Yorker, and it showed a lawyer sitting at his desk, and there's a client sitting across, and the lawyer's looking at some papers, going, "You have a pretty good case, Mr. Pitkin. How much justice can you afford?" The principle of the thing. That's sometimes for unsophisticated clients, but it's also a reality for very well-heeled clients, where sometimes their sense of what's right and wrong is so offended that they're not going to take it lying down. They're not going to give someone else a satisfaction, and they have the money to back it up, and they're willing to spend it. This is a reality. Sometimes it's I can't let them get away with that. Again, a principle-based reason for not settling or for picking a particular settlement value or negotiating range. Sometimes it's a sense of trying to make the world a better place, and part of that is I'm not going to give them a license to do this. I don't want them to do this to someone else. I'm not going to give them the satisfaction. Sometimes it's a sense of equalizing or sometimes revenge. I've been through a lot of pain of whatever kind it is, and I want them to feel like I do. Sometimes, I mediate in courthouses. Sometimes when I do that, if the clients need it, I might just say, look, these courthouses are filled with people who have been wronged. That's why they're here. So almost everyone who comes here feels like they've been wronged. That's what these places are for. Sometimes that helps. You have to use your discretion when you bring up those kinds of things. This is a big one. They disrespected me, or they can't treat me like that. People get angry and they get offended and they get upset and they lose what they think is respect or they feel is respect. And so sometimes what they're saying is money or other settlement demands, but what's really driving it is this. And you know this because when you're in the room and the clients are talking about it, this is what they're talking about. You just know it. It doesn't happen in every case, but a surprisingly large number of cases, this is a significant reality. And in certain kinds of case, a strong interest in exerting and demonstrating control. I see this most frequently in something like employment cases, where there's maybe a history or a relationship, sometimes a long-term relationship between the parties, and someone just has known these people and they're just not going to take this line down. Maybe an employee feels that way or an employer. I also see this dynamic a lot in trust litigation cases. Strong interest in exerting and demonstrating control, long-term relationship, or it can happen in business relationships where partners have or shareholders, people who've known each other for a long time, something goes south, something goes sour. Sometimes the whole history comes back up and it's who's going to be in control. In those kinds of cases, these last two are absolutely critical in order to be able to bring that kind of a case to resolution. Let's talk about mediation briefs. What are the key benefits to sharing your brief with the other side? And I've talked about this a little bit about not sharing briefs, but let's talk about it for a minute. Opportunity to vote by your phone. There's a runaway winner here with projecting a good faith negotiating style, thereby promoting trust in the negotiations. If you come into a mediation and the other side is not going to share their brief, what's the natural response to that? What are they afraid of? More likely is what are they hiding? Or are they even serious about this? Why are we spending our time? Why are we wasting our time? Why are we going through this? Is there anything to tell us what their claim is? Like, everyone has been through lots of mediations where briefs were shared. What is it about this case why they cannot share their brief? A real valid negotiation or consideration here. This one on the bottom about the good faith negotiating style. This one here, this has got the lowest votes. You save considerable time with the mediator. I truly believe most mediators make a studied effort to honor confidentiality. If you have a brief and it goes to the mediator only, then the mediator may not know how much of that brief they can share with the other side. And when they get into the room, how do they effectively press your case, explore your case, the strength of your arguments with the other side if they cannot even discuss them? So if you have, we all learn this by experience as far as litigation goes, that your litigation practice takes on your own personal style and your own personality. Same is true with mediation. And there's a lot of different styles of mediation. And if there's not a real pressing of your case and a vetting of your case with the other side, then this is less important. But if you're going to mediate with a mediator who wants to take your arguments to their side and start saying, what about this? What about this? How are you going to get around this? How are you going to counter this? What evidence do you have on this? And literally start arguing your case in the other room. If the mediator doesn't have a situation where your brief has been shared with the other side, their hands are tied. They can't explore that. And then they have to come back to you on every point and say, can I share this? Can I share that? It's unworkable. It's just impossible. It slows everything down, and time, even though we go for a full day, time is so precious. It looks at the beginning of the day, we got lots of time, but how many mediations do we all get through where we start getting it towards the end of the day and there's still a distance to go? So you have to keep the clip up all day long or you're going to run out in difficult cases at the end of the day. Then people get tired. Then they say, let's put it down. And then things sometimes go sideways. Whereas if you could wrap it up that day, a lot of times you get a better result if you can. So this is a significant one for me. You save considerable time with the mediator. You pave the way, another one, for opposing counsel to share your brief with their client. The very first decision I have to make as a mediator, right off the bat, is who's driving the bus in the other room. Is it the client or is it the attorney? If it's the attorney and the client is just taking whatever their attorney has to recommend and really very passive or very malleable for what the client attorney is going to recommend, then this consideration, this second one, is less important. But if you have a client who is headstrong or independent minded or running the show, driving the bus, when I used to litigate, I would prepare my brief. Sometimes it was for the opposing client attorney. It often was for the opposing client because I wanted that opposing client to see the strength of my case. And I didn't know how their own attorney had presented it to them. I didn't know if they'd really given the full scoop. If maybe thing was a little bit, had a positive shine on it, I wanted them to see my case. So I wrote my brief for the opposing client many, many times, especially if I had any sense that the client was the one driving the bus. So if you have a situation where you think the client is maybe in control and maybe the client doesn't fully appreciate the risks or the problems that they have with their own case, this can be very valuable. And then, of course, this one, by sharing your brief with them, you invite them to share their brief with you. And that way, you're just so much further down the road when you get to mediation. If you have a common understanding of what the disputes are, the commonalities are agreed upon, the issues that are not, then you can be in a much better position to make effective use of your time and see how you can hammer those things that need to be hammered so you can see if you come to a resolution by the end of the day. Who's your primary intended audience for your mediation brief? And I talked about this a little bit in the previous slide, but we can take just a moment here. Let's take some thoughts, our collective thoughts. Who is when you're doing your briefs, who's your primary intended audience? run away in favor of the mediator. Certainly the mediator. If the mediator lacks the facts and law that are underlying your case or your defense, your claims, they cannot explore them in the other room. So the mediator, of course, is essential. This is an interesting one. Your own client. This is a reality too. We've all had cases with difficult clients who maybe don't want the things that would be in their own best interest, but they just don't really see it. They lack the sophistication. When that kind of a case gets to mediation, most of the time the attorneys try to put on a good face, especially to the other side, because you can't broadcast or telegraph that you've got issues with client control or your own client. You just can't do that, especially when you're dealing with your client, because they see you as their champion, and they should, and that's how it is. But in separate caucuses between just the mediator and counsel, when situations warrant it, it's possible to get a sense of this. That sometimes these briefs are maybe for people's own clients. Maybe if they refuse to hear reason, or they have their own ideas about how things work and they see it in black and white, sometimes it can be a valuable education tool for your own client. Or that's one side of the coin. The other side, of course, is client development or client marketing, client understanding. They see you as the champion, and they see what a great job you've done on the brief, and then they have greater confidence in you, and hopefully they'll take your recommendations as far as settlement goes and you get the case settled. So that's an interesting one. Opposing counsel, obviously yes. Opposing client, obviously yes. We've talked about that. Why submit your brief on time or early? I regularly deal with insurance adjusters, and the theme is always the same, which is, as the case progresses on mediation day, and you're talking about money, you always get this, well, that's all the authority I have, or we don't have that today, or we can't get that. And then when you probe even just a little bit, what you get is, we reviewed this beforehand thoroughly. We took it up to 3 different layers or levels. Different people, this is how we evaluate the case. It's how we see it. Okay, well, as a mediator, if it's clear to the other side it's never going to be in that range, then that precipitates questions for me like, well, do you think it might ever change? Well, I don't know. Could. Well, what do you think? You know these people. You think it'll ever change? Well, it might. The problem is the insurance professionals require time to evaluate the case. If you think about it, and we all know this, all the insurance company has is money. They have liability and policies, and all they have is money. And they cannot open the tap too fast, too far, or too hard to let it go too fast. And insurance counsel live and die by this. So you just can't do that. And the way they control it, the way they keep the tap turned down the right amount, is by settlement authority. Before the mediation starts, they've evaluated this case, they've reviewed it. And if they don't review it and they don't see the risk or the likelihood, they will tell you, we just don't see it. We're just not there. I recognize there's a cost of defense, we're prepared to pay it. We just don't see it. If you don't do your mediation brief on time, or you don't get it early to the other side, you forego the opportunity for the insurance company to make a studied determination as to what your case is worth. So even if you have a great case, on mediation day, they may not come with authority. You can't settle that day. That doesn't mean you can't maybe get it on a later day, but you've chewed up a day. Sometimes things change. So if you're going to try and make the most of mediation day, give the insurance company enough time so they can evaluate it. Sometimes it takes them a couple of weeks, So if you can actually get your brief in a couple of weeks in advance to the other side, that so well lays the groundwork for the insurance company to have the time they need to carefully evaluate the case. Now, we've all had cases where insurance adjusters come in at the last minute and they make a couple magic calls, and they can do it sometimes on the fly. Sometimes that works. Other times it does not. So the way you remove that as an issue, get your brief to the other side early or on time. Mediators are real people. They're busy. They have schedules. And sometimes, if you don't get a brief until 7 o'clock the night before mediation day, you do your level best to review it and to digest it, but it may not get the same type of study consideration that it would get if you had it in several days before that. So if the mediator understands your case better, let's just be blunt. Let's be clear. Mediators are people too, and they are. And the thing is, so many of us take our job so seriously and want to give good service, whether we're the attorney or the mediator or the judge. It's just true. Not in every case, but in so many cases. And if you can really digest it, and if it's persuasive, the first person you want to convince, of course, the mediation, is the mediator. I mean, you want to get the other client and the other counsel. But if the mediator feels of the validity and the strength and the empathy and the sympathy of your side of the case, if they really kind of feel that, sure, they need to argue both sides. They need to do the best they can. But we know that as people, we can detect sincerity and we can detect vibes and emotions. And if you can sell the mediator on your case so that they think it's a really great case, it's just easier when they go into the other room and they're presenting it to the other side for them to make a compelling presentation. Here's what the other side says. Here's my concern for you. If you don't settle this now and it goes before a judge and jury, how are they going to feel with A, B, C, X, Y, Z? And they just reiterate the points in your brief. How is that going to play to a judge and a jury? And of course, the response to that is, well, we think a judge and a jury would never go with that. But in reality, what they're thinking is, yeah, it's a concern, So that's why we're here to talk settlement. You give the mediator the best opportunity by giving the facts, the law, and time. Invective is defined as insult. There's a dictionary definition. Insulting, abusive, or highly critical language. So this is a scale, a sliding scale, and you can vote on your phone. Invective in a mediation brief is a useful aid or can be a useful aid in the mediation process. 0 is strongly disagree, 10 is strongly agree. Let's see what our collective thinking is on this. We're way down at the left end, and I've kind of already talked about this on the purpose of going to the client, but the reality is, if your brief is aimed at the opposing client and there's invective in there, castigating the opposing client, disparaging them, calling into question their motives, making them look poor, then in addition, the difference is, realistically, when you get to trial, the person you're trying to convince is the judge, or the person you're trying to convince are the jurors. When you're at mediation, the person you really have to convince is the opposing client and counsel. And so if you can, if you attack the opposing client too strongly at trial, you run the very real risk that the jurors may rise to their defense because they don't know who wears the white hats and who wears the black hats, or who the good people are and who the not good people are. They don't know that. At the mediation, the person you have to convince is the person that you're actually opposed against. So if you put invective in your brief and you make it really spun up, then their back goes up. Then it's emotional. Now you have to deal with all the emotional issues on top of everything else that you're dealing with, and it slows things down, and sometimes they just dig in. And I had a mediation last week, where someone just, the pigs get fat, the hogs get slaughtered. Someone was just too intransigent about their position, demanding too much, and the other side just said, I'm out of here, and they walked out and left. There was nothing I could say. You couldn't save it. You said, I'm cutting this off right now. You've insulted me, and off they go. It doesn't happen often, but it doesn't get us any closer to settlement, at least on that day, unless there is a particular strategic reason for spinning the other side up, and that might happen. And if that's so, then that's a calculated decision. If there's a reason why you want the other side to be spun up, then go for it. But unless there's a reason, if it's just because it's been a frustrating case and you want to lay it out for the record because that's the way the other side has conducted themselves or the way the other client has been, and you're getting that from your own client that they've been difficult to work with, take a step back, take a deep breath, and say, is this sentence or is this invective, is it going to help these people want to settle with me, or is it going to push them further away? And what's my goal at the mediation? If at trial, use as much invective as you think you can get away with the judge and the jury, whatever you think is going to be effective. Number 3, why won't the other side settle? Because they don't see the case like you do. Because they don't value the case like you do. Here's the third part. Because they genuinely expect to prevail at trial. This is also a reality sometimes. They really think they've got these great odds at trial. Sometimes settlement seems impossible because the parties literally are in different universes. So when that happens, when the parties are really light years apart, why don't they just keep chiseling away with offers and counteroffers until they reach a settlement somewhere in the middle? Why don't they do that? Sometimes that works. So I sometimes refer to these as ping pong or two-step cases. Back and forth, plaintiff taking incrementally smaller steps or incremental small steps, defense making incremental small increases until you come to agreement or a meeting of the settlement number somewhere in the middle. In my world, oftentimes, those are the easiest cases to mediate and to settle. Because what's happening is the parties are making roughly equal moves. Sometimes it's not equal, but they're doing the work of the mediation. They're taking the temperature of the other side through the offers and the counteroffers until they meet somewhere in the middle. Those are the easiest ones because the parties are doing the work and everyone knows how it works. It's very ordered. You feel very much in control of the process, and you just go until parties are willing to keep moving until it's settled. Those are the easiest ones. The more challenging cases are those where a party won't even respond to a move unless the other side makes a major move. The one party won't even respond. So it goes like this: demand, offer, freeze. Not even going to respond. Okay, we're here at mediation. They say I'm not going to respond. Why do parties do this? Let's take an open-ended question here. These are all good points. I'm going to talk about this first one. I'll take more if people are willing to share more. Insulted by the offer. Yes. Ran out of authority. Yes. Different realms of universe. Yes. To force the other side to bid against itself. Sometimes you can get that to work. And when you can, it's great. If the other side is motivated enough to settle and if you can get them to move without moving at all, great. But I recently was in a meeting of mediators. We talked about a mediation where one side, without disclosing any of the facts, said, I settled a case recently, this is one of the mediators, after 63 moves. 63 moves. 63. He said what happened is that the plaintiffs would make a demand, the defendants would come up by $1. Plaintiffs would make a different demand, plaintiffs would come up by $1. $1. So why would somebody do that? Why would the defense come up by $1? Isn't that like a slap in the face? But you look at the alternative, which is nothing at all. So when you get to a mediation and the other side refuses to move at all, how does that feel? it feels like a complete hardball or a complete stonewall. And then you get responses like the other side isn't negotiating in good faith. They're not serious. We're wasting our time. I've got a lot of work to do back at the office. They're not even going to negotiate. Why are we even here? You get those kinds of responses, which are legitimate. That's how it feels. By making $1, what the defense does is they say, we're interested in settlement. We're willing to move, but you're in the wrong range for what we're willing to do. So they're trying to telegraph that. If there's too much confidence on the other side, on the plaintiff's side, about what's going to happen in trial, that goes nowhere. The defense has to come up materially or the negotiations end. But in that case, it worked. So we know this. We know this, that at mediation, the parties frequently will telegraph a message to the other side about what that party is willing to do or where they're willing to go. That's common. When we're doing it with offers and counteroffers, the way we telegraph those messages are by the timing and by the amount of the jumps. We do that. But when you get a mediation where the one side just says, I'm not even going to move, and then the other side says, well, if they're not going to move, I'm not going to move, then you're just completely stuck. Then what is the message that really happens? Really, what the side who first says that, I'm not going to move, what they're really telegraphing is, we need to be in a different negotiating range. But they don't say that. They just say, I'm not going to make an offer. And so the other side is left to take it as they will, which sometimes isn't good. But really the message is, you're in the wrong range. We're here, we're willing to talk. We just have to be in a different range. We all know that sometimes parties telegraph where they're really willing to go by the ranges, like by the midpoints. And that's a lot of the background and a lot of the philosophy on doing brackets. Sometimes you can communicate or telegraph where you're at without making a firm offer or specifically, explicitly saying so. Two key reasons, and this is what we were just talking about. Either that the midpoint is wrong. So in other words, if we've got two different universes and we got the plaintiff sky high, out of the stratosphere high, and the defense in the basement low, and the midpoint is wrong. And one of the sides is using the midpoint as kind of the indicator where the case is likely to go, then they feel like I can't even move. I can't even move because the midpoint's wrong. Or sometimes, and this is very common. The side that stops says, I'm not going to make an offer because I have no confidence that the other side is going to get into the right negotiating range where I'm willing to do it. They don't say these words. What they say is, no response. We're not going to make an offer. Rarely do you get this kind of analysis or this kind of detail, but that's really frequently what's going on. They just don't have any confidence. The other side's going to do it. They're just way up, way high. No, we're not going to get anywhere, so we're just going to stop. When the parties stop exchanging offers, the path forward may not be entirely clear. What should you do if the other side won't even respond to your good faith move? I'll invite responses here by the voting on the phones. As a very young litigator, I'm going to talk about this fifth one. I was very straight up, very straightforward about what I was willing to do and what my client was willing to do. And when the mediation didn't happen, then I just assumed we're going to trial. And sometimes that happens. In a settlement context and as a more senior lawyer, what I realized is a lot of times people rethink this. They come back, it might be a month, might be 2 months, might be 6 months down the road, maybe right before trial. Even if a mediation fails, it doesn't mean that it's terminal. It just means it's not going to happen that day. Other times I've had cases though where it didn't happen in mediation, they really did go to trial. No further mediations. I mean, parties had a change of heart, change of position, something happened, and that was it. That was the day. So You have to make that evaluation before you walk away from the day, of course. If there are available dispositive motions, like there's a pending summary judgment motion, well, both sides can say, well, we think we're going to win this, and so we'll settle on that basis. But frequently, my experience is the party that spent the time and the money, energy, and effort to put together the summary judgment motion thinks there's a reasonably good chance of it being granted, or most of the time they wouldn't have done it. Not in every case, but most cases. That can be very challenging to mediate while you've got a pending dispositive motion. Doesn't mean it can't be done. It's an added challenge. Suspend the mediation, let them think it over. That can be effective in some cases. You have to make your evaluation. Are they likely to dig in? Are they likely to change? Is there a chemistry here today that might not be present later on down the road? And sometimes that happens. Proposed brackets can be very effective as a way of telegraphing where you're willing to go, but I'd like to focus on this one. Empower the mediator. Empower the mediator. Yeah. Empower the mediator. Empowering the mediator depends on your mediator's skill set, disposition, and approach to mediation. I'm going to be point blank here. What happens when you choose your mediator? If you're choosing a whole skill set, a whole approach to mediation, a whole approach to life. And the way to be most efficient is to figure out as best you can, whether you talk with colleagues who have used that mediator or you've mediated with that mediator before, to look at that mediator's strengths and skills and play to that. Shape your mediation according to what your mediator is most comfortable and most skilled at doing. And that's the way you can make the most of their skills to try and get this case to settlement. Now, some mediators are most comfortable conveying demands and offers between the parties without pressing the parties too much. And we've all been through mediations like that. As a litigator, I went through many, many of those where the mediator never came in and pressed me. They did not explore my case with me. They did not explore the other side's case with me. It was literally what I've heard described as carrying water. It was demands back and forth where the parties lay the groundwork and they take the laboring oar to test the other side's resolve and interest in settlement by the offers and counteroffers. Is the tried and true method, the time-tested method, the classic way of handling mediation, and it can be very effective, especially when it works. In difficult cases where people are not willing to make offers for the reasons we've talked about or others, that may not be enough. So in these mediations where you have back and forth, the parties do much or most of the work in determining the other side's appetite for settlement. Other mediators will press your case with the other side. They will take your facts and your law and your arguments in your brief and vigorously discuss them with the other side. So one of the calculations is, if you want a mediator that's going to do this, then make your evaluation when you're selecting your mediator is, are they going to explore my case with the other side, and are they going to explore the other side's case with them, having read the briefs, digested the law, maybe even read a case or two if it's something they're not up to speed with, so they can really explore this with the other side, say, what about this? You get to trial, how's this going to play to a jury? You're at trial, how's this witness going to go from the other side? How's that really going to play, do you think? Those kinds of questions. You would think that this happens with every mediation, about pressing this with the other side and exploring the case, but I promise you it does not. Because the mediator is neutral, the parties are often willing to share information with the mediator that they would never share with opposing counsel. This is as true as the day is long. There is good reason for this. Parties intuitively and instinctively know that if they communicate their weakness or their concern or their bottom line to opposing counsel, it will be used against them as a next round of settlement moves, and they are right. But if the parties have confidence in the mediator, that the mediator will not disabuse them or take advantage of them or make a misstep of some kind, then oftentimes the parties are willing to kind of give some pretty good indications to the mediator what they might be willing to do if the mediator asks for it, if they request it. Many times they'll do that, and it's not a formal offer, but it's kind of like a could you, would you, how about this, if we could get it to this, would you do that? And a lot of times people will give you a sense on where they are at. And I refer to it as telegraphing a settlement range or a number, like maybe, oh, we want to do something in this range. So even though the actual numbers being exchanged are much higher, a plaintiff might say, yeah, well, we might be willing to do something in this range. That type of information is absolute gold because it gives you an insight as a mediator into what the other side is willing to do. Or the defense says, you know what, we don't think it's worth it, but I mean, if the plaintiff would take this, maybe we'd do this. It's absolute gold. Because if you're in a stuck position where the parties have stopped making offers and you can't go back and get the one side to move because they don't have any confidence the other side is ever going to come into the right range, this is just about the last thing you're left with other than brackets. And brackets narrows the gap. So one really great way to do it is you start with a typical classic back and forth ping pong approach. You hit a block, you hit a snag, brackets. Parties don't want to communicate a midpoint that's not right. You hit a snag, you get to this. Empower the mediator. What would it take? What if I could get this? That kind of thing. If both sides will participate in this approach, the mediator is able to explore settlement possibilities at specific ranges or numbers that look very different from the formal offers being exchanged between the parties. And what you can end up with literally is two concurrent parallel sets of negotiations going on at the same time. One with the formal back and forth numbers, and then the one where the rubber really hits the road, which is, what if we could get to this? Would this work? What about that? Going on at the same time so that nobody is looking weak. No one's giving away too much information. You still have the back and forth going between the parties, but then in the background, you've got the real dialogue that's going on about what's it going to take. Super effective. This approach to mediation requires a high degree of mediator skill and a high degree of trust between counsel and the mediator. And the trust has to go both ways. The mediator has to be skilled because if you're getting involved in this kind of discussion with each side, as a mediator, you have, not only do they have to trust you so they'll disclose it to you, but as a mediator, you have to decide, are these the kind of people that if they give me this kind of indication and we can get the other side to that, are they really going to do that? Or are these the kind of people that they say will do this and they seem sincere, but if it looks like we can get there, then they're going, well, on second thought, we actually wanted something more, and back up, start negotiating backwards, and that happens. As a mediator, it's absolutely miserable because you put yourself on the line to try and get to something that they've reassured you is going to work, and then they start sensing that it might actually happen, and it's like, well, we actually need more. It's absolutely miserable, and it absolutely destroys your trust with your mediator. After that point, it's like, okay, well, I can't trust anything you're going to tell me, so how are we going to do this now? Yeah, in that mediation and in subsequent ones, mediators, like dogs and people and judges, have long memories. They remember this. However, if you have the trust between parties and the mediator is willing to ask and explore what would it take if you can't get there through the back and forth ping pong or through the brackets, the results can be dramatic. You end up settling cases, and the comments you get after are something like this: I never thought this case would settle. I never thought it would. Parties were so far apart, bitter litigation back and forth between the parties, and then you end up with a settlement. It absolutely looks and feels like magic, and it can be dramatic. What it comes down to is the parties were never willing to telegraph to the other side what they were actually willing to do. Before the mediation even started, they wouldn't telegraph it for fear that would be used against them in the next round of negotiations, but they were willing to communicate it to the mediator. And once this third party, you get this triangle going, once the mediator has that and can broker it between both sides, you have a case that actually could have settled before, but nobody trusted the other side enough to make it happen. And so even though theoretically our clients pay us to represent them and their interest and to settle cases and speak for them, because of the lack of trust and sometimes communication between counsel, they bring in an additional layer of cost that is oftentimes worth its weight in sheer gold. So back to this question. Why is trust between the mediator and the parties so important? And I've kind of talked about this a little bit, but we'll just spend a moment here. Actually, no, we're still close to the end. I've talked about this. I'll skip the comments on this one. Here's the last point. Why won't the other side settle? Because they don't see the case like you do, because they don't value the case like you do, because they genuinely expect to prevail at trial, and because they want to get the best deal possible. When the other side doesn't settle, if they understand both the facts and the law, they value the case, they understand what it is, they're not missing some fact, but if they won't settle because they want the best deal possible, they are not negotiating the case. They are negotiating you. The price they're willing to pay, or the price they're willing to settle for, is what they think they can get from you. They're negotiating you. If that's their approach in settlement, the best deal possible. Sometimes parties employ hardball negotiation tactics in trying to get the best deal possible. But most parties, and this is based on years of experience, most parties are focused primarily on their own settlement needs, values, and goals. Just statistically, in the mediations that I've handled, which has been a lot by now, it's been since 2016. My runaway experience is that most people are focused on their own settlement needs, values, and goals. There are some who are making their valuations, not their valuations, their demands based on what they think they can get from you, and that's the key thing. And there's an element of that in many mediations, granted, but kind of just generally, most parties are focused on their own needs, values, and goals. That's not to say, however, that even if you're not having somebody who is basing their own numbers based on what they think you can get from you primarily, that there isn't room for some good old-fashioned horse trading. Of course there's some of that. Of course, when we negotiate, nobody wants to leave money on the table if you're plaintiff. Nobody wants to give away the store if you're the defense. Nobody wants to do that. And a big part of what we do is based on what the other side has to say or what they're willing to do. Perfectly understandable, reasonable, legitimate. But if that becomes the whole basis and you're willing to negotiate backwards to get there, it can be very, very frustrating. So let's talk about this. We got a couple minutes left. Why do plaintiffs sometimes come in with a sky-high opening demand? Most plaintiffs don't want to leave money on the table. But my experience is that when the plaintiffs come in with just a huge settlement demand, that's not because they're really planning to leave money on the table at that level. They know it's high. They know it's high. So yeah, they don't want to leave money on the table, but they want to set the range. They want to set the range. So this first one is they want to get the range at the right level, and coupled with the second one, they're expecting a low defense offer. So they've got to have some room to negotiate. There can be situations, I think, where maybe some plaintiffs hope the defense will accept such a demand, but that's not my experience generally. Generally, it's these first two. They want to have some room to negotiate. They're trying to set up the range. And that's why we get sometimes these offers where people refuse to give an offer on the defense side because they're not going to negotiate in that range. And then it's up to the mediator to see what you can do to find a range that's going to work for both sides to negotiate within. Or you end up just trying to broker a deal with both sides tell you what would it take. Why don't plaintiffs use their bottom line number for an opening demand? Because we're at time, I'm not going to take comments on this. I'll just review them briefly. Defense will think the plaintiff's true bottom line is something less, negotiate accordingly. Makes sense. Plaintiff doesn't want to leave money on the table. Makes sense. The plaintiff hopes to conduct negotiations at a range higher than their bottom line. Yes, you can't use their bottom line. Because if you do your bottom line and then you're not going to move downward, the defense is going to think you're stonewalling. It's a process of compromise. You're not going to compromise, and they won't take you seriously. So the mediation will fail. So the plaintiffs cannot come in. They cannot realistically come in with their bottom line number unless the defense is highly motivated to settle at that number. I send out a monthly newsletter on mediation related topics. If you'd like to be included, send me an email. Just say add me to your newsletter, and I'll do that. We've come to the end of our program, and we have just a minute for takeaways and closing comments that I'll take here, and then I'm available to stay and answer any questions. This has been a webinar, so we haven't been able to take questions during the course of the program, but I'm available to stay for as long as people have questions and comments or anything you'd like to share. It's been great being with you. Good luck to every one of you with your future negotiations and cases, and may they all be successful.
All right, Robert. So it looks like we actually have a couple questions here. Our first question from Dana Green. She asks, if a mediator asks to meet with attorneys only because both sides are so far apart and the other side refuses to meet, is there anything you would recommend them doing?
I can't tell from that question if it's a request to meet with both attorneys together or or each attorney separately. And surely if you have one side that will meet and one side that won't meet, it's going to be possible to meet separately with one side. I have had situations where I have met with both attorneys together. Those are the exception. Typically, people know what the other side's position is, and so there's not a lot of need for that. When I've done that, typically it's been because there was a lot of material to cover or a lot of very technical information in that case, and it was going to be a lot more efficient to have the attorney explain it if there was a question about that information or the technical pieces. So I'll bring the attorneys together so that they can get over that hump. It's usually a very discrete purpose or amount of information that I'm looking for when I bring them together. So I doubt this is the way with every mediator. I think it depends on the mediator's perspective on whether they have attorneys meet together, separately outside the clients, or together or separately, but mine is typically separately. And when I'm meeting separately with the attorneys, if the client is in Never Never Land, the attorney may not ever tell you that and may have what might look like very unreasonable demands to the other side that you can't figure out as a mediator. And if I sense that's happening or there's a problem between attorney and client, sometimes I'll ask the attorney if I can, and the client, I'll say, can I talk with your attorney separately? Of course, of course. And I'll say, the attorney can talk with you about everything we talked about when we come back in. I'll meet separately with the attorney, and sometimes you learn about those things. That's not to take advantage of the client or to take advantage of one side. It's very based on need. And if you understand what the client needs, then you do your level best to see if you can accommodate that within the parameters of the case can yield, recognizing that not every case is based only on money. There's other things. So it can be very, very successful meeting with attorneys separately in caucus. I can't remember having very many situations where I've asked or invited an attorney to meet with me separately where they've refused. I'm sure it happens. It just hasn't happened very often to me.
Okay, and then Jack Russo asks, when and how do you use quote unquote bracketing, and when and how do you avoid it, even if one side wants it and wants to get a mediator compromise?
This really varies by mediator. A lot of mediators use mediators compromises a lot or mediators proposals a lot. I typically don't. I extended one recently, because it seemed like the best thing to do. But what I do is I use a mediator's proposal device in almost every mediation. Instead of saying, okay, I'm going to give the mediator's proposal, and then if both sides accept it, fine. If they don't, nobody knows. I will use that dynamic, but without that kind of finality. And I'll do it in the situation of what if we could. And I'll say, I'll go to the one side and I'll say, do you think if I could get this? And what I'm trying to do is get a sense maybe on what might be possible at the other side. Say, if I could get at this, would it do it? And so I'm exploring kind of the same dynamic as a mediator's proposal without actually making the formal mediator's proposal. Now, I'm not sure I addressed all the pieces of that question. Was there something more?
Let's see. Bracketing, how to when to avoid it, and if one side wants it and wants a mediator compromise.
Oh, bracketing. I didn't address the bracketing. On the bracketing, it's really a touchy-feely situation. I don't use them in every mediation. It really depends. So, you know, in one sense, bracketing is just accelerating the back and forth process. And if you can't get the parties to move, then you can start proposing brackets like this, or you can invite the parties to propose a bracket. And then you can talk about that with them. Say, well, I'm not sure the other side would do that if you don't think it's going to be well received. And maybe you can shape a bracket and present that. And people are sophisticated and experienced enough to know, well, you know, I'm looking at the midpoint of the bracket. Does that mean this is really what we're talking about? And if the other side says, you know, I'll do a bracket, but the midpoint's not going to be there, then you can communicate that. So sometimes it can be a good way to keep some momentum going. A lot of times I've had mediations where people just it's just the wrong range and they just say I'm just not going to do it, but they don't give anything specific on what the other side would need to offer in order for them to come back and continue to mediate. So I've settled, I would say probably maybe 80% of my cases go like this: demand offer, settle, which seems almost impossible, but that's because I'm doing this exploration thing, which is like a mediator's proposal without being a mediator's proposal in the background. It can be super, super effective. Is there another question? And I see we've got one on the screen here.
Let's see. We actually have quite a few more as well in the Q&A box. Michael Schwimmer asked two questions. The first one, how can you determine who is driving the bus, counsel or client? And then his second question, what did you mean when you said don't get ahead of counsel?
Okay, I'm going to take the second piece on that first. Don't get ahead of counsel. What I meant by that is I was talking in the context of things that you might be offering or suggesting, and you can't do that. You know, you can't make promises on behalf of counsel. You can't give indications on behalf of counsel if the counsel isn't involved with that. That doesn't mean you can't say, well, yeah, I might be. What if I could get this? But you can't start saying the other side is going to do this or the other side. You know, you have to get that kind of authorization from counsel before you can do that. You have to respect the counsel. You always have to. That was the second piece of this question. Remind me of the first part, please.
The first one being, how can you determine who's driving the bus, counsel or client?
You know, when I litigated, that was much harder to determine than when I have started since I've started mediating. Because when you litigate, the only place you see the client is in deposition, and then you see him at trial. And so it's very, very hard. Deposition is such a highly structured and highly combative, you know, it's a tense situation. It's not easy to get a sense on who's driving the bus. So since becoming a mediator, when I'm a mediator and I'm involved in going to each room, you know, some attorneys are very, very protective of their clients, and they're just not going to let their client talk. In those cases, the attorney's driving the bus. You know, he's driving the bus, or at least I have to assume that because I don't have any indication that the client is. So what happens is when I am interacting with a room, I'm trying to direct my energy and my focus and my comments and my purpose to the person who's driving the bus. So, you know, there are some situations where the attorney has some significant client control issues. And sometimes the attorney feels a little bit at a loss or a little out of control, you know, a little bit helpless sometimes. And they will never communicate that to the other side. But when you go in and you start talking with them, it's just the body language and the comments, and you feel, or maybe if you sense something, you might talk separate with the counsel and you get a sense of this. And if that's the case, then I'm directing a lot of what I have to say to the client. Never, it's just not my style, not in an oppressive way or a aggressive way with the client. I always respect the clients. But if the need is on behalf of the client and the attorney has maybe got some difficulty with client control, then sometimes the attorneys are very appreciative that you can sort of help them with their own client. And so I'm talking direct with the client. Well, there's this and there's this. I'm sure you've talked with the attorney about this, but have you considered this? What about this? And this could go, and I have some concern about this, and it might go this way. And what about this? And you're really trying to either talk with the client about what the possibilities might be that it doesn't go right, or that it goes wrong, or that it can go right. I mean, all those things. And the interesting thing about mediation is, you know, you show up to a trial and it's structured. There's opening statement, you know, and then there's examining of witnesses, and then there's cross-examination and sur rebuttal, and it's all very structured. You show up in a mediation, there's none of that. You just show up, and it's literally you just have to go. You just have to go, and you have to start talking. and you have to figure out how you're going to get to this where this is well-developed dispute and understand what the dynamics are. And so even though in a mediation, I'm doing a ton of talking, I'm also just a huge sponge for information that's coming in. And you can get a sense if the client's driving the bus, the way that they interact in the room, if they'll let you be in the room with them when they have some talks before they separate out and start talking about numbers, you can get a sense on who it is. And and so literally what I'm doing at that point is I'm trying to understand what the client needs to see if I can get that. Because if I can't get what they need, then that's a roadblock to settlement.
Okay, so it looks like we have another question. Um, Here, Seth is asking, how often do you find that the parties come back later in a case for a second mediation and or are able to continue negotiations for weeks after mediation that doesn't immediately result in a settlement and eventually resolve the case?
That's a common experience, and it depends. I've had several cases just recently where the follow-up was far more time intensive than the day of mediation. So you do what you can at the mediation, and if the parties are interested and it doesn't settle for whatever, um, frankly, sometimes you'll do a mediation and everyone says, well, it's not going to work. We'll go to trial. And so you think, well, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot, and maybe I'll follow up with those. Or sometimes some time will go by, and then you'll get a call from one of the clients, or I'm sorry, one of the counsel, and they'll say, do you think if we did thus and such, we might get it? So what that says is people go back to their respective corners, they think about it. Maybe they weren't willing to do it day of mediation for whatever reason. They might not have had the settlement authority. If it's an insurance company, they might be rethinking it. Personality wise, if it's a personal case, maybe they've gone back and talked with their friends, their spouses, their family, whatever. Maybe they're rethinking this. So sometimes there's subsequent contact by the one side. You really can't ever disclose that. I don't think, because I think it would be unfair to that party. It would make them look unduly weak. So you can't disclose that. But what that means is you just have to say, some further communications with the party without it signing to who initiated it. Some further discussions, and what do you think about this? Or maybe you don't even take that. Say, you know what, I've been thinking about this case. I'd like to know, would you be willing to do this? So sometimes they can be very, very extensive. And I had an employment case a couple of months ago, hard fought, big money. And we did mediation and everyone was dug in. And I basically, my wife likes to tease me that I'm like the pit bull terrier. I got a hold of it and I just didn't let go. And I just kept coming back. And most of the time, it's the way that I see mediation. I see tenacity as just about the hallmark quality. And and so I usually don't stop unless people say, we don't want to talk to you anymore. We don't want to call, enough, we're not going to settle, we're going to go to trial. They tell me that, I stop. But if they don't, I'm back at them. And a lot of times you can make it happen. But it depends on the case. Some really there's no future or prospect. They don't want to have you talk further. And that maybe they come back, maybe they don't.
Okay, we still have two questions. What is the best way for a plaintiff's lawyer to get the mediator to treat policy limits as the floor rather than the ceiling of the settlement?
I've had mediations where the insurance company has paid over policy limits. Um, and my experience is those are not easy. Um, the insurance company hates to do it. They haven't typically come in and evaluated the case that way. Um, there has to be really a very decent, legitimate risk of a bad faith claim by the insured in order to make that colorable. And so it's not easily done, but I have seen it done. So as the outset, as a general proposition, um, I don't see in most cases the policy limits coming in just out of the blocks, the insurance adjuster showing up and saying, we got this coverage limit, that's our starting point. It doesn't matter what the mediator says, that's just not going to happen in most cases. They're going to come in, they're going to have their limits, and they're going to be viewing that as the ceiling. And before that ceiling, they're going to be having whatever number the roundtable has set of that, or whoever's been reviewing this case has set of that. And sometimes you can get past that, a lot of times you can, but that's what they're going to be doing to that. So if you're going to be looking past policy limits, it's going to be a fight, and there's got to be some pretty good backup to get there. That's my experience.
All right, perfect. And I have one last question from our Q&A here. If because of historical experience of parties, at least if one party shows trust deficiency in other party in honoring a settlement, how, as a mediator, would you deal with that situation, I guess?
If I can, what I'd like to, I don't want to miss this one that's on the screen, and we haven't addressed that. So if I can, I'd like to address the ones on the screen, if I may, then come back and do
That's
that.
absolutely
Says,
fine.
this was helpful, and I'd like to know more about why is a brief more important if we should be relying on empathy and skills to help move the mediation along. Isn't a brief more domineering? This is a really interesting question. If you analyze the vibe and the flow of most mediations at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the morning, we're still talking about cases, or we're still talking about facts. And that might go for an hour or two or three or four, depending on how complex the case is. But by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when the facts and the law are pretty well settled, everybody knows what they are. You've worked through the differences. You've made your evaluations as to what they are. And so you're talking more on the emotional side and on the numbers side at that point of the day. And finally, just it comes down to a discussion of numbers pretty much, or other non-monetary considerations. That's almost every mediation. So this is a great question when it's saying, why is a brief important if we're relying on empathy and skills? I'm going to give answers in kind of several pieces on this. I think in the first piece, and I do not discount this, I think the parties expect it, and I think the counsel expects it. And if as a mediator, I came right in and I completely dispensed with the brief and the facts and the law, and I just started saying, give me an offer, a number, what's it going to take? And I've had mediations like that, where there was a real simple case, and within 5 minutes, I was talking numbers and demands and offers. Those are the big exceptions. Very simple case, no issue about facts or law, almost admitted liability, very simple. It's just all about the numbers. Very unusual. But I think the parties expect it to talk about the substance. I think the counsel expect it. I'm reading a book right now called Never Split the Difference by a guy named Chris Voss. He's a former FBI hostage negotiator, and it's absolutely fascinating. And his point in there is that he says, well, split the difference. He says, so you come into a hostage situation, you got 4 hostages, you're the lead negotiator for the FBI. What do you say? Give us 2 hostages and we'll let you the other 2 have a good day? He says, no. He says the hostage negotiator, to be successful, has to get everything of substance from the other side without giving really anything of substance in return. And that's the hallmark of these FBI negotiators. These empathy and skills, the way the mediation comes in, to be just brutally honest, is it's a real-time organic procedure. And you're evaluating what's coming in right now in real time from each side and evaluating what those emotions are. And you have to be able to read, to mediate on this level. It's not where you're just doing back and forth offers and the parties are doing all the work, figuring out where the other side's at, taking their temperature through offers and counter offers. If you're going to do this more difficult grade or type of mediation, you have to be evaluating the parties and their counsel and evaluating the skills and the emotions. But the brief is like, it sets the stage for all of that. And if you've got one side that thinks, you know what, I've got this slam dunk piece of law or this slam dunk facts, and that shapes my view of the case, and the other side doesn't know about it, then what you're shaping the rest of the day doesn't take that into account. So you've got a disparity there between how these 2 sides are valuing the case. So you have to spend the first part of the day in a case with any complexity looking at the facts and the law so you can come to some kind of understanding as to what it is, and both sides understands the other side's case. And then you start talking about what does this do at trial with a judge or a jury? How do they do it? And this, of course, is the only opportunity that the clients get a chance to kind of tell their story. And we try not to spend too much time on that because it can show up a lot. But sometimes, excuse me, sometimes that's important. They want to be heard, or sometimes you have, even if they don't want to be heard, they need to be validated, especially with non-monetary considerations. But the briefs are the precursor. They're the foundation for all of it. So they're essential. I don't find the briefs domineering. It's just literally the starting point to try and get to a common set of facts and law so that we can argue it and discuss it from there. Back to you on the question. Next question. I'm sorry, you have to read it back to me again.
Of course. All right. So this is a question about context. How would you deal, or a mediator deal with a situation where, looking at the historical context of the parties, with one party showing deficiency in trust of the other party for honoring a settlement?
Could you read that last part again?
Yes.
Read the question back.
So one party shows a deficiency in trust of the other party in honoring a settlement. I'm assuming it's one party doesn't have trust in the other regarding honoring the settlement, I think is what the question is asking.
Okay. Well, this is actually a not infrequent occurrence, if I understand the question correctly. The way I understand it, so what I'll address is, how do you deal with it when there's a distrust between the two sides, maybe in the way they're negotiating, or maybe if you even get to a settlement about the other side's going to honor the settlement? I'll tell you what I do is when I was, when I was first out of law school and took one of my very first cases, we had a room full of attorneys, and I had the smallest bit player in the whole room. And we negotiated all day, mediated all day, got to a settlement. The lead attorneys, way my senior by many years, said, okay, we'll circulate an agreement next week. It'll be done. I thought, that sounds great. Took a full year. And I said, I will never do that again. I said, it was miserable. I couldn't get it done. I'm just not going to do it. And so what I did is, for 30 years, every time I did a settlement, I absolutely required the final form of settlement agreement be signed that day. And I litigated a lot of cases, and I never made an exception in 30 years. So I would take a settlement agreement with me, prepared, soft copy. Back in the old days, it'd be hard copy, but I never made an exception on that. And I could do that because I wasn't in these roomfuls of tons of attorneys. You can't do that. You can't control that. But my cases were typically ones where I could get it done. And so I would do that. I'd say, we're going to have a settlement agreement today, and we would do it. So I didn't have to rely on, and sometimes you would have people come back after the fact and have buyer's remorse, or talk to somebody and say, no, we want to rethink this. No, sorry, too late. We got a settlement agreement. So you're not going to be able to do this in every case. But if it's a case where the decision makers are going to be present, and there's any reasonable possibility of getting a settlement agreement signed that day, I think it's great practice. They could take a settlement agreement that day, so you can enlist the mediator, get their help in hammering out any remaining terms, and get the ink on the deal before people start thinking about it, or thinking I left money on the table, or I gave away the store, or my wife says I had to do this, or my cousin says I had to do that. Just get the deal done that day. So that's, I think, one thing you can do really proactively, is take a settlement agreement with you. It's hard to do because life is busy and litigation practice is busy. Sometimes there's not time, but if you can, it's great practice. And statistically, you're going to settle the case anyway, so you need a settlement agreement anyway, so it shouldn't be a waste of time. But that's one thing I think that you can do to try and deal with that. If you have a case where, for whatever reason, you can't ink a deal that day, you're at risk. You're at risk. And so, I mean, you don't want to not come to an agreement because you think they're not going to do it. I don't have a ready answer for that. I mean, you do the best you can. If you want to sign a term sheet, because that's all you can get, that's probably the fallback and the next best answer. But we all see from the advance sheets how many reported cases there are where people sign term sheets and then it blows up. So you do what you can. I don't have a silver bullet for that one.
Alrighty, well, this concludes our questions today. Thank you so much for your time, Robert, and thank you to our audience for staying with us tonight. Everybody, I guess, have a lovely rest of your evening.
Thanks. Thanks very much for being here.
You may be eligible for CLE credit in your state. Visit bhba.org/podcasts for more information.